Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Well, that was the week that was, as they used to say about 60 years ago, the week in which Keir Starmer announced his resignation. But before we get into that and try and put some of this week's events into historical context, a couple of parish announcements about the podcast. First of all, over the summer, we're going to spend some time doing a bit of a book club with some of the podcast episodes, in which we'll interview authors about their books that we think will be of interest to listeners to the show. You will have already heard one of them if you listened to our special episode on Tuesday with Matthew Elliott, Lord Elliott, the former chief exec of the Vote Leave campaign. We released that to mark 10 years to the day of the Brexit referendum. But we'll also be talking to several other authors about the legacy of Disraeli in the Conservative Party, about the first woman cabinet minister, Margaret Bonfield from Labour, about the interwar years, both the politics and the culture, Tony Blair's legacy, and several other themes too. So look out for those episodes coming out over the summer. Also, I just wanted to say to anybody listening who in particular researches and writes about conservative history, a bit of a shout out really for the Conservative History Journal that's put together by the Conservative History Group. If you've got some research or a historical topic, sometimes the more niche the better, that you're interested in and would be interested in writing about, then please do drop me a note. So my email address is in the show notes, and it would be really great to hear from some new people who are interested in writing for the journal. So I'd be very glad to hear from you.
Lee, what is your matter of interest?
Well, given that we've had another prime ministerial resignation this week, why do prime ministers not really fight on when they're under pressure? I mean, we've seen an example of this just the weekend before he resigned. Keir Starmer was doing pool clips for the media in which he said, quote, "If there is a contest, I intend to be in it and to fight it." And then as it turns out, there wasn't a contest and he was already out of it. Nobody even had to stand against him for him to announce that he would be resigning as Prime Minister and triggering a contest. And whilst we could say, perhaps somewhat cruelly given it's the end of his premiership, that this was one final Starmer U-turn, it's actually a mismatch between actions and rhetoric that is consistent from quite a few prime ministers, really. If you think about some of the Tories who were brought down, if you think about Theresa May and Boris Johnson in particular, both of them were subject to what Boris Johnson in his memoirs, and I hope I'm both quoting and pronouncing this correctly, the peculiar form of epistological assassination that the Tory party has, which is the no confidence vote system, unique to the Conservatives, not a process that the Labour Party or others have. And this meant that if 15% of Conservative MPs vote into the chairman of the 1922 committee, then there would be a vote. And what I find really curious in both of their cases is that they just basically sat there and waited for Graham Brady to call and to know that the vote was on and that they would fight it. Now, you may say, what else could they do? But in the 1998 Conservative leadership rules, there was a provision that the party leader could call for the vote themselves. And I think in both May's case and in Johnson's case, that's something that they could have done to basically say to their critics, look, I'm not just going to sit here as some sort of punching bag for you to have a pop out whenever you like and to try and get 15% of people to pick up their pens and write their letters so you can have a vote for me. I'm actually going to be fighting in this process as well. And I'm going to be fighting not just in terms of trying to improve my leadership and trying to progress the causes and the issues that I care about. I'm also going to be fighting using the rule book of the party in whatever way I can. If we take Boris Johnson's case, he ended up having a confidence vote in June of 2022, immediately after the end of the Platinum Jubilee celebrations for the late Queen Elizabeth II. There were better moments for him than to have that confidence vote then. When, for example, Russia invaded Ukraine earlier on that year, there was a sense that actually that would not be a good time to change Prime Minister. In fact, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives publicly announced that he had withdrawn his letter in Johnson around that time. And you might say that to call a confidence vote then might have been exploiting circumstances. But sometimes, if you really want to survive, that's almost what you have to do. It might be cynical and a bit grim, but politics can be. And certainly leaders who are under pressure sometimes need to be. And if I think about the last party leader, I would say really stood up to his critics, sees the agenda, sees the timetable as well, then I would probably identify John Major back in 1995. So John Major becomes Prime Minister in 1990. He pulls off a surprise election victory in 1992. But very soon after, his premiership starts to go wrong, and it pretty much stays wrong for the rest of his time in office. It never really recovers. And by the mid-1990s, in 1995, the Tories are being battered in the polls. They're being battered in pretty much every electoral contest that comes up. And on top of that, the party is also quite badly split.
Europe.
Yeah, it's partly split over Europe, and in part what the party's position will be on issues like the future single currency. The way in which the leadership rules worked at the time is that Conservative MPs could only challenge John Major in the weeks following the Queen's speech, so the state opening of Parliament. And to do so, they would need 10% of MPs to say that they wanted a contest. The 10% definitely existed. There would have been a contest as and when, but the only way to get it was to basically run down the clock until after the Queen's speech. But John Major thought, well, why am I just sitting here waiting, giving them time to get organised? And so he walked out on the 22nd of June, months before the contest would otherwise have been, resigned the leadership of the party, and then said he was going to stand again for the very same position. He remained as Prime Minister throughout this period. Now, as it happens, that's not something that a Conservative leader can do now. They can't resign and stand again for the position, but you could then. And what that basically meant is that he had first mover advantage in a huge way. He was able to, and I interviewed Michael Portillo about this some time ago, he was able to basically take Portillo to one side and say to him, look, I'm standing to be leader again. I want you to support me. And Portillo was bounced into saying, of course, Prime Minister, when he was probably the best person to challenge him. And if he had challenged him, Major's career probably would have ended there and then in 1995. What Major managed to do was basically create the dynamics for the leadership crisis and not leave it up to his opponents, such that in the end, only one member of the cabinet, John Redwood, who was not too long ago appointed as a Conservative member of the House of Lords, he was the only person to resign from the cabinet and stand against Major. And when the contest came, Major got 218 votes to just 89 for Redwood and lasted until the 1997 election. Now, what I think Major managed to do there was actually remarkable because, like I say, he had a divided party that was staggeringly unpopular, and he won really a landslide victory among his own MPs in a straight fight to survive until the next election. And I rather think some of his successors could have been a bit more nimble, a bit more calculating, a bit more fleet of foot, a bit more on the front foot, in fact, when facing their own leadership problems, if they really wanted to survive, rather than just having what I think we saw with Boris Johnson, Theresa May, and with Keir Starmer, a bit of a bunker mentality to try and deny reality until it catches up with them and can't be avoided any longer.
Well, what I think you're getting at there, Lee, is about the importance of timing in politics and about the importance of risk-taking in politics, that actually political success requires gambling from time to time. It's a high risk but high reward enterprise. And I think no one really rises to the top of politics, or few people rise to the top of politics, by just taking always the easy decision. And what you've talked about in terms of a leader inviting a challenge against themselves is quite an interesting one. And it is worth remembering that a leadership challenge is not always detrimental to the incumbent leader. The Labour MPs in 2016 who tried to remove Jeremy Corbyn soon discovered that actually the best thing that ever happened to Jeremy Corbyn in his leadership really was that 2016 leadership challenge, because it was a way for Corbyn to refresh his support among the membership, where Corbyn's support actually very slightly increased in 2016 relative to where it had been a year ago, even though Labour MPs were saying that Jeremy Corbyn was a disaster and needed to go, and blamed him for losing the Remain side of the EU referendum, etc., etc. And after Corbyn won that leadership challenge in 2016. His position was basically, I think, unchallengeable, at least for the rest of that parliament, and as it turned out, for the rest of the next parliament to come, because the following year, Corbyn fought an election and lost the election, but such was his positioning within the party, partly because of that leadership challenge, that he was able to stay on and fight another election in 2019. When it comes to Keir Starmer, we're going to talk about, I think, in a moment, some of the what-ifs of his leadership, and could he have done something differently to save his leadership? Had he been perhaps a bit bolder in the gambles that he took, or perhaps did he take the wrong gambles in his leadership? But I should also say that challengers to leaders need to be sometimes brave in their movements. And I had said for months, really since I think September of last year, that Wes Streeting, if he wanted to become Labour leader, needed to move quickly, because he was in a relatively strong position to challenge Starmer due to the absence of any other realistic contenders. The former deputy leader of the party, Angela Rayner, had had to resign due to her tax affairs. Andy Burnham was not in Parliament, and at that time people weren't really discussing the idea that Andy Burnham would be parachuted in a by-election. And so there was a moment when already the Starmer leadership looked like it was pretty far in the doldrums for Streeting to move. And Streeting decided not to move, and this week Streeting has announced that he's not standing for leader. Why? Because now that Andy Burnham is back in Parliament, he knows that he's not going to be able to defeat him. It might be the case that Streeting has a longer range vision than I have about this, and perhaps Streeting is taking the view, well, if I serve in a senior role in the Burnham government, perhaps as Chancellor, I will detoxify some of my associations with the Blairite right, which is not where the median voter in the Labour membership is. And when Andy Burnham has to resign as Labour leader and perhaps also as Prime Minister, then maybe it's my chance then to go for the leadership. So maybe he's playing that longer game. I wouldn't put it past him. He's a pretty canny political operator. The challenge with all of this is it's easy enough to sit here in my armchair and reflect back. And you look back in history and say, well, why didn't someone do this? Or couldn't someone have done that? And you've just done the same with poor old Boris Johnson. But in the moment, you don't necessarily know if you're actually making things worse for yourself by taking that risk. And so, yes, Boris Johnson could have invited a vote of no confidence against him earlier on, but what if he had miscalculated? And what if they had pulled the plug there and then? You know, in a way, I think back to Margaret Thatcher's downfall in 1990, and I sort of think if Thatcher had known how things were going to turn out there, she would have been much less complacent, bold about how she approached that leadership contest than she did, but she thought that she was going to win. And sometimes there is the danger that a leader can be a risk taker out of overconfidence that then comes back to hit them in the face.
Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, of course, Starmer, in his resignation speech outside Downing Street on Monday, somewhat oddly said that he was going to ask the Labour National Executive Committee to set up a timeline for his replacement, and then when about announcing his own timeline for his replacement, where he said the nominations for a candidate would open on the 9th of July and would conclude when Parliament broke for the summer recess on the 16th of July. That got me thinking about the last time that a Labour Prime Minister resigned mid-term, and that, of course, was Tony Blair in 2007. When Blair resigned in 2007, he did something rather different than Starmer. So rather than Blair just say, this is when the process will begin, and at some point in the future, I will be replaced probably in 2 or 3 months' time, Blair said, "This is the date of my departure. I am going to stand down as Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party on the 27th of June, 2007. And I am asking the Labour National Executive Committee to make sure that my replacement is in place by that date." That, to me, is a much clearer and a bit more of a bolder power move to say, this is the end point, this is the date when it's going to happen, make the process work towards that goal, rather than this is the process, let's follow the process, and eventually the process will take us to a good place. In a way, I think that speaks to something about the different attitudes that Keir Starmer and Tony Blair have towards governing, where Keir Starmer is a process man, and Starmer's view sort of seems to be, I don't actually need to come to a firm view on what the ultimate outcome will be. We just need to follow this process and eventually we'll get there. So in this case, I, Keir Starmer, don't actually need to give the date of my resignation. It will just happen at some point and I will let other people determine that date for me. Now, looking back at Blair, I then thought, well, it would actually, I think, be quite useful, I hope, to listeners to actually play back the sequence that led to Tony Blair's departure as Prime Minister in June of 2007, because there are some similarities with the Starmer departure, but actually the things that I find more interesting are the quite striking differences. So in this story, we have to go back a little bit to early September 2006, the 5th of September 2006, Lee's birthday. On that day, I don't know if you remember this, Lee, 17 Labour MPs led by Tom Watson signed a letter calling for Tony Blair to resign as Labour leader and Prime Minister. The following day, Tom Watson, who was the ringleader of this plot, resigned as a junior defence minister. The following day, the 7th of September 2006, Tony Blair I think he's at a school, if I remember correctly, and he says to a journalist that, in a somewhat offhand comment, but clearly he must have come to a determination that he was going to announce this, that the upcoming Labour Party conference later that month would be his final party conference as leader. And that was basically taken as Blair announcing his resignation. But if you think about it, Blair is saying on the 7th of September 2006 that the party conference that's at the end of September 2006 will be his last party conference. But what that means is he's basically giving himself up to a whole another year as Prime Minister. Quite clever, actually, if you think about it. If you've got all this pressure to resign, how can you maximise the amount of time that you can stay in office?
In Blair's case as well, maximise it or push it a little bit further out until he hits that symbolic point of having been Prime Minister for 10 years. Now, not to say that was his guiding motivation, but I think there's something quite important about a decade premiership, really.
And I don't actually think it's irrelevantly, because it helps to explain something of the timeline that then follows. At that party conference at the end of September 2006, on the 25th of September 2006, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor, confirms that he will be a candidate for the Labour Party leadership once Tony Blair announces his resignation date. And it's also on that same day at that conference that the Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, John Prescott, says, when Blair goes, I go. Prescott announces that he will resign as Deputy Leader as well. That basically placates things for a while, although I should say, and I can remember this, I used to watch Prime Minister's Questions weekly at that time. I mean, I still do. I think I was probably even more assiduous when I was a teenager. David Cameron was really merciless against Tony Blair in trying to get Blair to actually pinpoint the precise date when he would go, and Blair would not be drawn. Blair dropped various clues along the way. So at a press conference in January of 2007, Blair is asked about the EU leaders summit that's been planned for the end of June 2007. And a journalist asks Blair, well, will you be Prime Minister at that summit? And Blair replies, of course, I'll be Prime Minister at that summit. Well, it's not really, of course. That's actually quite big news, because that means that Blair is committing to staying Labour Party leader at least until the 22nd of June 2007, which is when the EU summit concludes. And that may have not quite been as quick a timetable as some people were expecting. So we know that Blair is intending to stay Prime Minister at least until June. On the 2nd of May 2007, Tony Blair has become Prime Minister for a decade. The only Labour Prime Minister in the history of the party to serve an unbroken 10 years as Prime Minister. Indeed, no Labour Prime Minister has even served a broken 10 years as Prime Minister, so really quite an extraordinary achievement for Tony Blair. The following day, the 3rd of May, are the local elections and the devolved elections in Scotland and Wales. And Scotland, it's bad news for Labour. The SNP come into government in Scotland. And in England, in the local elections, Labour loses 665 councillors and control of 18 councils. So it's not a great set of local elections for the Labour Party. And the following week, after those bad local election results, Tony Blair announces the date of his resignation. So it's on the 10th of May 2007 that Tony Blair says, on the 27th of June 2007, I will resign as Prime Minister of this country and leader of the Labour Party. NEC, National Executive Committee, set up the process for my replacement. 3 days later, on the 13th of May, the Labour National Executive Committee does just that. They say that the following day, on the 14th of May, the nomination window, the window for collecting nominations, will open. This to me seems much more sensible than what Keir Starmer has announced, where he has announced this long period of weeks between the announcement of his intention to resign and the opening of the window to collect nominations, and then the closure of nominations. Back in 2007, it all happens within a week of Blair announcing his resignation date. So Blair announces his resignation date on the 10th of May. Nominations open on the 14th of May. Nominations close on the 17th of May. When nominations close, there are only 2 Labour MPs who collected any nominations. One is Gordon Brown, and the other is John McDonnell, who, of course, was Shadow Chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn in the Corbyn years, but at that point had just been a Labour backbencher, first elected in 1997, so he'd been a Labour MP for 10 years. At that time, you needed 45 Labour MPs to nominate you. Gordon Brown got 313 Labour MPs to nominate him. 88% of Labour MPs nominated Gordon Brown, and John McDonnell only got 29 nominations. In other words, Gordon Brown had collected so many nominations that it was impossible for any candidate to stand in the leadership contest against him. The story was quite different in the deputy leadership contest. John Prescott had been true to his word. Remember, he said that he was going to resign as deputy leader when Tony Blair announced his date of resigning as Labour leader. And unlike Keir Starmer, who said he was going to stand for leader and then change his mind, Prescott was true to his word. And in that contest, 6 MPs cleared the nomination threshold: Harriet Harman, Alan Johnson, John Cruddas, Hilary Benn, Peter Hain, and Hazel Blears. So then you have this quite weird situation, actually, because Tony Blair has already said he's not going until the 27th of June. On the 17th of May, there's only one person who's got enough nominations to stand for Labour leader. So actually, you know, in a sense, you might think, why wait? But indeed, because Blair had set out his timetable, Brown then was sort of de facto leader-elect but was not going to come in as Labour leader for another 6 weeks. So what did Gordon Brown do during that time? Well, it's rather interesting. There was, of course, that deputy leadership contest that was ongoing. And at that time, you had the Electoral College where MPs and MEPs voted in one section, ordinary Labour members voted in one section, and then members of affiliated organisations, trade unions and socialist societies voted in another section for the deputy leaders. And in order to win in that very crowded field, the deputy leadership candidates held hustings around the country. Well, rather than sit around in 11 Downing Street, Gordon Brown joined them. And Gordon Brown went round the country alongside the deputy leadership candidates, taking questions from Labour members and trade unionists and journalists and members of the public, doing his own kind of hustings in a campaign where he was the only candidate. He even had branded materials that said, I can't quite remember, but I think something like Gordon Brown for Britain or something like that. So he was running a campaign as if he had opponents, even though he didn't. On the 22nd of June, the ballot closes for the deputy leadership contest. There is no ballot for the leadership contest because Brown was the only candidate to get the nominations. There's a special conference held 2 days later to announce the winner of the deputy leadership contest and to confirm Gordon Brown as the winner of the leadership contest. And finally, 3 days later, on the 27th of June, Tony Blair resigns as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and leader of the Labour Party. Gordon Brown becomes leader of the Labour Party. Harriet Harman becomes deputy leader of the Labour Party. Gordon Brown refuses to appoint Harriet Harman as deputy prime minister, something she was still smarting about in her memoirs a decade and a half later. I know that's possibly a bit long-winded, but I thought it'd be useful just to reflect on that process, which is rather different than the process we're experiencing right now. But it's the only other time that an incumbent Labour leader has resigned under a system of rules where the franchise is wider than the Labour MPs. Of course, Harold Wilson resigned in 1976, but he only had to deal with the Labour MPs. So I wonder, Lee, what your reactions are to that. Do you think that it was better under Blair and Brown, or do you think Keir Starmer has charted a better path for himself and the country?
Well, better for whom would probably be my first thought. I think if Starmer had done something very similar to Blair, then it would certainly be better for Starmer. As I mentioned in my matters of interest, the way in which prime ministers don't really fight effectively to maintain their role, I think, is a growing theme. And one of the ways in which Starmer could have fought on would have been if he had basically done what Blair did in the immediate aftermath of the local elections. If he had had the political nous to sense where the mood in the party was going, then he could have said, look, I will not lead this party into the next set of local elections. Once Labour had been battered in Scotland, battered in Wales, battered in pretty much everywhere in England as well, he could have said, look, there's such a mood for change. I will have a steady transition. I'll give a new leader time to lead the party up to the next local elections, and I'll be gone. Don't worry about that. And I actually think at this stage, where we'd be is that Keir Starmer would still be Prime Minister. Andy Burnham wouldn't be in the House of Commons yet. I think there'd still be this pressure for Burnham to get in. He'd still want to, and other people would still want him to. But Josh Simons wouldn't have resigned so hastily. I suspect Wes Streeting would still be in the cabinet. I think things would not have come to a head quite so much because Starmer would have lanced the boil somewhat by saying he was going and basically telling his party, look, you can try and drag me out the door like the Tories did with some of their leaders and look at the damage that did the party and its reputation. But I've already told you I'm going, so what's really the benefit but possibly a few months or so? So I think Starmer could have done that. He could have done a Blair and he could have stayed on a bit longer. From the perspective of the country, my view on prime ministerial authority is that you either have it or you don't. And once you don't, you should get off the stage. And the way in which several prime ministers, Blair isn't the only one to do it. Others have done it too. David Cameron said in 2015, before the general election, that would be his last general election as leader of the Conservative Party. He said he'd do the next term, but wouldn't stand again. Significant blow, in my view, to his authority, an unnecessary thing to say. Ideally, actually, what you should do is you should really keep them guessing. You should stay until you can't stay anymore, and then you should announce that you're going and allow the party to move on. And I think we've got to a stage where, on a couple of fronts, leadership transitions have become actually quite indulgent on the part of leaders and the parts of parties. When you were speaking, I was thinking about this difference between a coronation and a contested election. And the '07 example is a good one because you get both happening at the same time, but one's for the premiership and one's just for the deputy leadership. On the Conservative side, there have been, in the post-1965 years, so that's when the Conservatives adopted the leadership rulebook for deciding who the party leader would be. Same rules in office or in opposition. There have been two coronations. One in opposition, that was Michael Howard in 2003. He was the only person nominated. And one in government, that was Rishi Sunak in October of 2022. There was a near coronation with May, but there was actually a leadership battle in Parliament. It just didn't go through to the members. And in some ways, having a coronation, as it seems very, very likely, although won't for some time yet be certain that Burnham will benefit from. In some ways, that's quite good for the leader because it tends to imply that there is as near to a consensus as you can get in politics around that person becoming leader, or certainly a high degree of consent that nobody else is nominated. It also means that they don't then spend weeks tearing chunks out of each other with briefings via the press from other leadership campaigns, trying to undermine them and take them down. And it's also quick in the sense that Burnham can be in much quicker with a coronation than he can with a leadership contest. But it does come with downsides too. One of the downsides is that a coronated leader lacks something of an internal mandate. And that was certainly a problem for May at times, I think, when there was not the members' vote. In the eyes of some members, she lacked a bit of legitimacy. There was often the feeling, I think, about Brown, although there was nobody else who could possibly have become Prime Minister in 2007.
Well, Charles Clarke claimed that he had the numbers.
I don't know I don't even know what to say to that, really. I find that incredible. Incredible in every sense of the word. I think it's impossible anybody else but Brown could have become Prime Minister in '07. But there was sometimes a sense that he hadn't been tested in his rise to the top, in spite of going around for these hustings and doing a little side part in them. There was a sense that he may have benefited from a resounding victory in a leadership election. I don't necessarily buy it, but sometimes you could say that. There is also the argument that if you have a leadership election, that parties can at least have some internal debate about where the party is going. And if this is just the crowning of Burnham that's going to take place in the middle of July, then whatever the nebulous ideas of Manchesterism or Burnhamism may be, they're just accepted as the ideas that now lead and dominate the Labour Party, without debate, really, unless something dramatic happens. Andy Burnham is basically leader-elect of the Labour Party and Prime Minister before he'd even sworn his oath to take his office as an MP this week. I mean, it's quite staggering without any internal debate. But at the same time, because of the way that the major parties now do their leadership elections, the only way you can really have a debate, especially in the Labour Party, is to have a process that goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks and brings in members and party affiliates and others. There are many downsides to electing leaders after bitter public campaigns like that. Not least the fact that you can then drag out these contests for an incredibly long time and leave the country basically in a state of limbo. That was what the Conservative Party concluded in 2022, when it thought it might have to have two leadership elections in the same year. And it thought, gosh, well, we really can't have another process that goes on for 8, 10, 12 weeks. We've really got to truncate it and speed it up. And I think Labour will be wise and just to crown Burnham, even though that will bring him some disadvantages too.
I think some sensible points there. Just a couple of thoughts I just want to pick up on in your comments, Lee, about the sort of length of time for the handover. I think quite often that's seen as a bad thing in British politics. But on the other hand, there are potentially some virtues to having basically a transition period between leaders. Unlike, say, in the United States, where they have this lengthy transition between presidents, of course, one of the things we're famed for in Britain, and unlike, say, continental European countries with proportional representation, is that we have pretty decisive election results, and the outgoing prime minister is replaced pretty quickly by the incoming prime minister. But there could be a case, particularly when it's an intra-party transition between leaders of the same party, that maybe you want to have a bit more of a transition such that the outgoing prime minister can provide some assistance to the incoming prime minister. So in the case of Blair and Brown, there was, of course, a lot of bad blood between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown by that point, the TBGBs, as people used to call it. But there were things that Blair did that were helpful to Gordon Brown, even if maybe Gordon Brown wouldn't admit it. So Blair made sure that Gordon Brown had meetings with George W. Bush, the President of the United States, during that period, one-to-one, Chancellor of the Exchequer to President. Not the normal thing to happen, but in this case, obviously, because Blair knew that Brown was going to succeed him. Or Gordon Brown had time actually to put out his own policy agenda. And I think partly to try and chivvy Tony Blair along, Gordon Brown put out a quasi-manifesto in January of 2007, setting out his policy vision. But what that did mean was that there were 6 months where Brown's policy ideas were subjected to scrutiny, and Brown had to answer for them, and Brown had to develop his ideas about what he was going to do as Prime Minister before he became Prime Minister on, as it turned out, the 27th of June 2007. I know many people don't look back at the Brown premiership very fondly, but this is when I joined the Labour Party, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. And it was a very difficult set of circumstances, but I think there was a sense of purpose behind the Brown premiership. And part of that had been cultivated, of course, in the lead up to him becoming Prime Minister. And I think it contrasts quite sharply with the total sense of drift that we've had under the Starmer leadership, but I fear possibly also under the Burnham leadership, although time will tell.
That's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. If amidst all of the emergency podcasts and God knows what else of this week you've missed our interview with Matthew Elliott, Lord Elliott, about his new book 10 Years On, looking back at the Brexit referendum, that's available wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you want to hear it ad-free and support the podcast, you can join our Patreon. There's a link to that in the show notes. Otherwise, we'll be back on Sunday, when we'll be giving our own take on the Brexit referendum as we finish our Cameron's referendum series, looking at the vote not on the 27th of June 2007, but the 23rd of June 2016, that ended David Cameron's premiership and set Britain on the course to leave the European Union. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.